They tore my brother from my arms at the auction block when I was no more than 12, and I can still hear the crack of the gavel like it was thunder splitting the sky. That sound has never left me. It rattles inside my chest even now, decades later, freer in body, but never free in memory. The chains on my ankles left scars that the river water could not wash away, scars that Harriet herself once pressed her fingers upon as she whispered, "Keep moving, the night is our cover." I ran beneath a sky where the stars felt like burning witnesses, guiding me north, but with every step my heart dragged behind, heavy with the ones I left in the dark fields, bound and bent. Freedom was not triumph that night. It was a wound that bled differently. I tell you plain, escaping was harder than staying, because staying meant dying slow, but running meant living with the names of the lost carved into your soul forever. My name need not be known, for in bondage names were taken, twisted, or traded like cattle. What I carried instead was the memory of my mother's voice and the weight of soil that clung to my bare feet in the Carolina low-country fields. The year was 1860, the year the air itself seemed to hold its breath before war, and I was one among thousands bent to the earth from sunup to nightfall. If you're hearing this, I need you to listen to the end, for it is not just my story, but the story of all who labored under the lash and sang to the stars when no ear of mercy listened. I walked away with Harriet Tubman when the night was thick, yet behind me, the cries of those left chained burned louder than the dogs on our trail. I cannot rest easy unless their voices rise again through mine. If this reaches you, speak on it, so the silence doesn't bury us again. Write what you feel, share what you carry. Let it not vanish like smoke on the river wind. My story is not for pity. It is a record, a confession, a plea. Remember us, and let the chains we bore not be forgotten. The mornings came long before the sun. A horn would split the night air, low and cruel, dragging us from thin blankets laid on dirt floors. I remember the smell of damp earth, of sweat that never washed clean, of smoke from the small fires that had gone cold by dawn. We rose quickly, for to be slow was to invite the whip. My hands would grope for the rough shirt I had been given, a sackcloth thing that scratched my skin until it toughened into leather. Children wore little more, and shoes were a blessing none of us expected, except in winter, when frost bit hard enough to break the flesh of our feet. The fields stretched endless, a dark sea before first light, row upon row of cotton. When the sun rose, it burned down hot as judgment, and the work began in silence. The overseer's eyes never blinked, and his horse's shadow moved with ours across the furrows. Fingers bled from the bowls, small cuts that festered when the sweat ran down into them. By midday, we were given a ration, a handful of cornmeal or salt pork if the barrels had come in. Sometimes nothing more than what scraps we could boil, with weeds. Hunger became a second skin, and yet we moved faster, for the crack of the lash was swifter than any hunger pang. I still hear the rhythm of the hoe in my bones, the dull thud, the scrape against root, the grunt as backs bent lower. Pace was everything. Too fast, and you burned out before sundown. Too slow, and you felt leather tear your shirt and then your skin. Women labored beside men, children beside mothers. No regard for age except in how many pounds you could pick, or how long you could last. Babies were strapped on shoulders, while hands still reached down into the earth. If one cried too long, the sound drew fury, and the mother's punishment was doubled, for both silence and labour undone. On Sundays, when the work eased, we sought pieces of ourselves that the master's law could not own. Sometimes they allowed us the chapel, where a white preacher read the verses that told us to obey. Other times, we made our own church deep in the woods, whispering the old songs under our breath until they rose into the canopy. The hush arbours, we called them, where the spirit moved freer than any overseer's whip. We prayed there, not for heaven only, but for strength to survive the week, for a chance to hold our families together another day. Yet families were never ours to keep. My own blood had been thinned by the auction block, brothers and sisters scattered, like seeds cast into the wind. A man might love a woman, but love held no shield when the master's debts grew heavy. A child followed the condition of the mother. Partus sequitur ventrum, they said. The law carved into our lives. Born to bondage, growing into bondage, dying in bondage unless some miracle broke the chain. Night was the only time we breathed, a different air. Mothers hummed to children, low songs about crossing rivers and finding rest. Some told stories of Africa, lands I never saw but felt beating in my marrow, when drums were tapped faintly on pots and pans. Others whispered of escape, of stars that pointed north, of a woman named Moses who led her people with no staff but courage. Most of us feared such talk. Fear was bred into us, the fear of dogs, of patrols, of the rope that swung from trees, like fruit. And yet even in fear, a seed of defiance lived. We slowed our steps when we could, hid bits of food, taught letters in secret marks scratched into dirt, shared every scrap of kindness that was left to us. That was life before it all. Shifted, dawn horn, sweat, lash, whisper, song, silence, repeat. Each day a mirror of the last, until a moment came when the mirror cracked and the shards cut deep. I tell you these things so you know, bondage was not only chains and whips. It was the steady theft of every ordinary moment, of every chance to be human, until even our dreams were bent low like our backs in the field. And still, we dreamed. They came at dusk, when our cooking smoke rose straight, when the air turned that colour between gold and bruise. I was a boy then, small enough to fit behind my mother's skirt, old enough to fetch water and run messages between huts. We heard the dogs first, thin, hungry barks that did not belong to our village, then feet, many feet, and the flash of iron like a second sunset. The men who kept the paths, hunters, traders, sometimes neighbours pressed by fear, swept through with ropes. I remember the itch of dust clogging my throat as we were driven toward the coast, my wrists bound to my brothers, then to a stranger's. The women tried to sing us steady, but the songs thinned each mile. Those who stumbled were lifted by others until they could not be lifted anymore. When the ocean smell first struck us, salt, fish rot, tar, some cried out with a hope that died as fast as it rose. The sea was not an end. It was a door that opened the wrong way. They kept us in a long, low barracoon by the water, a fort that was not ours. White men's voices scraped the air, English, French, a few words I only learned later. The Africans that guarded us would not meet our eyes. The floor was packed dirt. The walls ran with damp sweat. They shaved our heads and rubbed us with palm oil, like we were gear that needed greasing. We were weighed and prodded. I watched them count brass rods, cloth bolts, muskets, and lay them like ransom at the feet of men who measured our bodies as if they were measuring a harvest. My mother was not there. We had been split long before the surf. A man with a scar down his cheek put his hand between my brother's shoulders and pushed him toward a different group. I called out, and he turned once. His mouth moved with my name, but his voice did not reach me. I never heard that voice again. They marched us along a wooden walkway to a ship whose sides towered like black cliffs. The plank shook with our feet. The hold swallowed us, and the light pinched to a wick flame and then to nothing. The smell was the first enemy. Wet wood, iron. The sourness of fear turned to vomit, the sweet rot of waste. We lay pressed belly to back, shoulder to shoulder, like seeds in a dried gourd. They fed us in handfuls, pea stew warm at best, and forced us to dance on the deck, meaning we were driven to move under the lash so our legs would not rot beneath us. Some prayed in tongues I did not know. Some struck their heads against wood to make a hole into which they could vanish. At night the sea moaned. I learned the rhythm of the ship's bones, the creak complaining with each slap of wave. Death came often, without order, fever, despair, the cough that rattled and then stilled. Those without breath were hauled up and pitched overboard. We did not say farewell because there were no words that could cross that water. Weeks bled into each other. I learned to count not with numbers, but with the turn of the stars when they let us up. My hands found the seam of the plank where I lay, and worried at it until a splinter came free. I held it like a knife, though it could not cut. Once, during a squall, a woman beside me broke her bonds by twisting until the rope slipped at her wrist. She ran for the rail. 2 sailors caught her, and she fought them like a hawk in a trap. For a moment she wriggled free, her foot on the rail, hair flattened by rain, lightning making a white river out of the sky. She jumped. The sea opened and closed. The sailors shrugged as if she had dropped a bucket. When we reached land, the air was different. The light felt harsher, as if the sun here had more authority. They herded us into a clean-smelling yard where the buildings were neat and painted. Nothing like home, nothing like the fort. A man told me later this was Charleston. They oiled us again, made us shine, and set us in rows. Men and women with feathered hats and gloves walked among us, touching shoulders, lifting chins, prying mouths. My name was a shape I was not allowed to keep. They called me boy, and then prime, and then a number. A bell rang. A man with a red face and a blue ribbon on his hat sang our prices in a cheerful voice. The gavel struck like it had, the right to decide our blood. I watched a woman with a baby reach for her husband and be pulled the other direction. The baby screamed until its voice turned hoarse and then thinned, then stopped, not because the child had ceased, but because someone had shoved a rag into its mouth. A woman with a narrow jaw and steady eyes bought me. The papers said I belonged to her, but truly I belonged to the land she owned. The low, drowned fields along a river that slid toward the sea like a snake. Rice was the crop there. We lived by the tide. The fields were cut into squares by dikes and trunks, wooden gates that creaked like elders. In the morning we opened the trunks to let the river's brown water flood the fields. At night we closed them to trap the water for the storks to drink. Mosquitoes clouded so thick they were a living smoke. Fever lived in our bones and woke when the air soured. Still, the rice would not grow without us. They taught me the task system, how much to weed, how many yards to hoe before I could move to the next row. The iron hoe wore a groove in my palm. My shoulders learned the angle of the sun by the pane that moved from left to right. The overseer rode a grey mare. Her hooves made a sound like heartbeats on the levee. If he shouted, we jumped. If he smiled, we feared the more, because a smiling man can surprise you with cruelty. Women sang to keep the pace. We had a song for everything: sowing, weeding, harvesting, mourning. Some were the old songs with words that tasted of palm and red clay. Some were new, born from mouths that learned hard English. At night, we cooked what little we had: hominy, hoe cakes, a strip of salt pork if luck had visited the smokehouse, collards when we could steal them. On Sundays, if the task was done, we slipped to the willow stand and held church, each voice leaning on the next like ribs in a basket. I was paired to a woman from a neighbouring place. Mary was her name here, though her mother had given her another. We jumped the broom by moonlight, hands clasped. We made a vow that had no power in the eyes of the law, but bound us to each other in the only court that mattered, the court of need. The first child we buried small, the ground sucking back what the fever had taken. The second lived, a girl with eyes like fresh-turned earth. The third, a boy who clutched my thumb like he was pulling himself up by it. We kept our children close, as if our skin could armour them, though we knew we were building a house of reed before a wind that never tired. The master's debts are a tide that takes what it wants. Partus sequitur ventrum, some clerk wrote, meaning the child follows the condition of the mother. I did not know Latin, but I knew what it made of us, a pasture that bred profit. Punishment was a loom we were woven into. There were collars heavy with bells that clanged when a body moved, so you could not slip quiet. There were iron bits to gag a mouth that spoke too much or sang the wrong words. There was the whip, braided and oiled, which made a sound when it struck that was worse than the strike. Once, when a man named Jacob ran and was taken, they put him in the stocks by the big live oak where every path met. They left him there 3 days, sun and mosquito and thirst using him up. We were made to walk by slow and look. On the second day, he whispered a psalm and then a joke that made the woman beside me snort despite herself. He died that night. And, in the morning, the overseer said, "See the wages," and unlocked the wood. We took him to the corner of the burying ground and lowered him by hand. At dusk, we went back to work. Not all our defiance showed itself. We broke a hoe handle, claimed a fever, hid a clutch of eggs, switched seedlings so the corners of the field the overseer favored yielded less. We taught letters with sticks in dust. A boy from the big house, curious more than kind, left a torn primer near the well, and from it I learned to carve my name again. First by scratching on a board I hid under my pallet, then by breathing the letters into my girl's ear until she could draw them on my palm in the dark. I learned to read a few scraps, a passage in Exodus, a hymn, a notice about a runaway that made my heart kick like a rabbit. Reading made the world wider and crueler both. I could now see just how far the river ran. Stories from beyond reached us like messages in bottles. An old man who had been in Saint-Domingue as a boy told how the cane fields there once burned with a fire that sang Liberté in a tongue that set planters' sleep on edge for years. He described men and women who sharpened cane knives until they shone like poured moonlight, how they broke sugar kettles and laws in the same night. He said ships had come with soldiers and left with ghosts. The masters said those stories were lies, but fear has a smell, and we smelled it on them when the old man spoke. They want the island to stay an island, he told us, as if ideas do not learn to swim. The years made grooves in me. My back took the shape of labor. My hands, calloused until they felt like iron cleverly disguised as skin. My daughter grew quick as a rice shoot, and my son learned to balance on the levee like he was tightrope born. We counted the seasons: plant, flood, drain, harvest. Now and then a trader would come with a ledger and a voice like a door hinge, and ask the mistress into the parlour. We knew what that meant. Men who had been our uncles would be rowed away in a flatboat. Women who had been our sisters would wrap their babies and stand straighter than usual so the buyer could not see how. The moment bent them. We grew used to last looks, eyes lingering a fraction longer in the yard, hands holding a beat past release. If we embraced too tight, we were told to remember ourselves. So we did. We remembered ourselves as people whose bodies were conceded, but whose love was not. I kept a little garden behind the quarters, where I coaxed okra and cowpeas from the stingy soil. On good nights, I would dig 2 peanuts from the mound and hand them to my children, who ate them slow and ceremonious, as if they were a feast. Mary told stories that made the children's eyes widen and then fold into sleep. I lay beside them, counting breaths, imagining a net made of our names stretched over us so nothing could pluck us away. Then came the year the mistress's cousin died with debts like sinkholes. A tally was made: horses, furniture, land, and us. We were numbers, arranged to fill someone else's lack. The cousin's creditors came with paper teeth. The mistress walked the rice fields with a widow's mouth, tight, as if holding in tears or rage. 2 boys and a girl, I heard the overseer say, as if ordering shoes. Strong. 8, 10, 12. My son was 10, when the man in the parlour smiled and set his hat on his knee. I knew he had selected the exact coin he wanted and was deciding how best to pay. I did not sleep that night. My son lay sweating beside me, though the air was cool. I pressed my hand to his chest and felt the drumming. Before first light, I went to the willow stand, where the trunks groaned like old backs, and met a man who sold fish on the river. He was free, born to a mother whose papers had survived a fire despite a judge's wish. He wore his freedom like a shirt you could see through. We traded small things sometimes, news most of all. He had a cousin in Charleston who worked the docks, loading rice and lumber, and who knew men who said the word Philadelphia with care, as if tasting it. He looked at my face and did not waste time with anything soft. "If you are going to get that boy away," he said, "you must move before the ledger moves." He told me of men who came down the coast with packages not always the same as the ones they shipped, and of a woman who had walked whole families through the dark like she was born with eyes where others had none. "They call her Moses," he said, and the name shivered the air. The plan was not a plan so much as a prayer stitched to a series of small risks. The fish seller's cousin arranged for me to carry sacks to the wharf one evening when the tide was high and the ship's belly open to receive. I would fold into a barrel under sacks of rice and breathe through a reed until the cargo hold swallowed me. There, I would be a shadow among shadows until the ship nosed into a port where men with eyes like lanterns and hands like rope would pull me from the dark. "You will not be the first," the cousin said. "You will not be the last." He said a name I had learned from a tract tucked in a hymn book, William Still. He said another, Harriet Tubman. He said these names with the respect of a man who has stood in a current and felt it take his legs from under him. Mary and I did not have a choice that looked like a choice. We could let the boy be sold and hope he survived wherever the map sent him, or I could go, make a path north, and return for whoever could be pressed into that aorta of risk. Our girl pressed her forehead to my chest and said nothing. My boy did not understand. He only understood that his father's arms were around him longer than most nights and tighter. "You come back, Daddy," he said, and I told him yes, though. My mouth did not know how to shape the truth. We waited for a thin moon and a cloud that could hide us. The fish seller rowed me under a deck where barnacles were sharp as teeth. I carried sacks on my shoulder alongside men who looked at me and then looked away, the kind of looking that is kindness when anyone watching might call it crime. The barrel was half full of rice, its edges rubbed smooth by years of use. I climbed in and scooped the grain over my legs, breathing steady like a man slowing his own blood. He slid the reed into the staves and piled more sacks on top. I learned each sound anew, the slap of rope against wood, the grunt of men lifting, the tremor of the plank as the barrel rolled, then a lift, a sway, darkness pressed against me like a second skin, and the smell of raw rice closing around me like straw around a sleeping animal. Time in the hold is not like other time. It is measured in drips and the scrape of rats and the syllables of words you mouth to yourself so they cannot be taken. I starved and then forgot I was starving. I sweated and then grew cold. When the ship moved, the rice shifted and my body found new ways to ache. I thought of the first ship, the one that took me across the big water, and I made a fist until my fingers cramped. I promised that this time the water would carry me to something other than a price. When the hatch cracked open, light stabbed my eyes in a way that felt like mercy and warning both. A whisper, "You are safe if you are fast." Hands, black and sure, reached in and pulled me up. They carried me into a stink of tar and fish and the sweet of molasses leaking somewhere nearby. A man with a narrow face and a careful way of speaking asked my name, and I told him the one my mother had given me. He nodded as if receiving not just a sound, but a person entire. "You made it to Philadelphia," he said. "I am William Still." He wrote my name in a book, and I saw him do it, and it felt like claiming a piece of air I could stand on. He asked about family, who and where, and I told him quickly, before words could turn to salt. He listened as if listening itself were salvation. They took me by alley and door you had to know to find. In the back of a church basement, a woman waited whose eyes could cut a rope and tie a knot with the same glance. She was smaller than I expected and bigger than anyone I had known. She sat me down and wrapped my hands in a cloth steeped in something that smelled like wintergreen. "Your feet?" she asked. I showed her the blisters, and she made a sound like a mother does when a child has fallen. Anger and tenderness braided. "You will have to move on them anyway," she said, and looked up at me as if to say, "We do not pretend here." "I am Harriet," she said, simply. And in her mouth the name Moses was not a boast, but a job description. She laid out the path in words that made the ground seem possible. From here to Camden, from Camden to New York, from there to the lake, and then the border where the law changes its coat. She spoke of men who would help and men who would sell us for the price of a new horse. She said, "We travel by night when we can. We travel by day when the night is watched. You step where I step. When I stop, you stop. When I sing, you listen." She showed me a paper with marks that meant stations, a map thin as a ribbon. She tucked it in her bodice and laughed when I looked too hard at it. "No man catches what he cannot see," she said, "and I cannot have you seeing what you don't need." We left with two others, a woman who had escaped from a house in Delaware and a man whose wrists bore the raw circle of fresh rope. Harriet led with a gait that said she knew every root before it thrust itself from the soil. She hummed, quiet as a bee. Sometimes the tune was nothing. Sometimes it was a shape I recognized. "Go down, Moses," but shifted so it could hide, in the leaves. When we reached a crossing, she would tilt her head and listen to the way frogs stopped and started. "Dogs," she would say, and her voice would harden, and we would melt into a ditch while the search passed like a brief storm. In a barn near the state line, we hid under a false floor, the wood so thin I could see boots pass inches from my nose. Harriet did not tremble. She breathed like a person sleeping on a summer porch. At dawn, she knocked twice on the plank above our heads, and the world returned. At one station, a Quaker woman pressed bread into our hands and said nothing more than "eat." At another, a blacksmith knocked the nails from a doorframe so we could slip behind a stack of kindling when a patrol rode through the yard. In New York, a man with a stovepipe hat walked with us down a street while talking loudly about the price of apples, and in his noise, we were quiet as mice. Once, when a train platform seethed with men who looked for faces like ours, Harriet stood us, all in a circle, and bowed her head and began to pray like a woman whose sorrow could drown a town. People looked away, embarrassed by so much God in public, and in that looking away, we were free to move where we needed. I told Harriet about Mary and the children, about the ledger, and my son's number pressed like a brand on my eyelids. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You made the first step. More steps will be asked." She did not promise me what she could not. She did not shield me from the iron she had learned to carry. "If the Lord spares me," she said, "I will go back again and again and again until I am too weak or they kill me." She was not boasting. She was scheduling. At the lake, the water ironed itself into a sheet so smooth it looked like a lie. We crossed at night in a boat that made hardly a sound. The rower's arms did not shake. And then the shore rose, and a man in a coat too thin for the cold stood and held out his hand and said, "You are in Canada." The word did not feel real in my mouth. The air was the same, salt and leaf mold and wood smoke. The stars were the same witnesses. But the ground under my feet did not hold me for someone else. In St. Catherine's, I worked with a tanner until the smell sank into my clothes like a second shadow. I sent letters south that I knew might not reach. I learned how to make money into parcels: flour, cloth, a small knife wrapped in oiled paper, a coin with a hole drilled through it to string around a little girl's neck. I gave these to men and women who travelled back across the line like salmon, who will not accept the law of the stream. Harriet came and went. Each time she looked thinner and brighter, like steel sharpened too often. "You come with me?" she would ask, and I would say, "Yes, if it can be so." And sometimes it could not, because the nets tightened, or because the way we knew had been cut by a new patrol, or because the people she guided were too many for one more. When it could, we went as far as the line, or not even that, doing what could be done, which is not the same as what is needed, and yet is the only thing possible. I could not bring them all. That sentence lives in me, like a nail I swallowed long. Ego. I could not bring them all. When Harriet and I moved south as far as we dared in the spring before the war, the fields I knew lay under their old sky. The same willow trunks stood watch. I saw from a ditch the shape of my son, taller now, his head a man's, his shoulders listing the same way mine do when I carry a sack, walk past the gate, and I did not call to him because the world is cruel. In particular ways, love is sometimes a sound that will get you killed. I went instead to the fish seller's willow and left what I had carried. A packet of needles and thread, a flint wrapped in linen, a small book with 2 pages torn out so the spine would not crack the first time it was hidden in a shoe. I left a note in the kind of handwriting a child might make, crooked and stubborn. Wait for the moon when the tide is high. I pressed my thumbprint beneath it, knowing what thumbprints do and knowing that knowledge cuts both ways. When we turned back, north, Harriet walked beside me and did not speak for a long while. Then she said, "We are not God. We are only his servants." I said I did not feel like a servant, but like a man with a bucket at the edge of a burning city. She stopped and put her hand on my arm and squeezed until my bone felt it. "Then, keep dipping," she said. "That is the work." News of war seeped even into the cracks where we hid and moved. Men in uniforms talked of liberty in words that did not always shape themselves into actions. But words matter. When the proclamation came like a bell tolling, it did not reach all at once, and it did not reach everyone the same. Still, the sound travelled. I watched men stand straighter, just hearing it might be coming. I watched women open their hands and let a grief fall that they had held without admitting it had weight. I watched Harriet ride a river in South Carolina with soldiers who had learned to follow her because she knew the water better than they did. And I saw the rice trunks open to a flood that did not drown but carried. Not all chains broke. Many did not. Some were swapped for thinner ones with finer names. But a door no longer opened only one way. I tell you this not to make of my life something grand. I am a man who was taken, who learned to work a field that did not deserve me, who carried in his mouth the names of those he could not carry in his arms. I found a way out because other hands made a ladder from their own bones and laid it down for me. Harriet was one of those hands. There were many others whose names will never be known because the law of memory is not the same as the law of justice. The Middle Passage is not some dead road under the sea. It is a current, and even now it pulls. Each time I lay down to sleep, I feel the ship move. Each time the wind shifts, I hear a gavel. Each time a child laughs, I hear my son saying, "You come back," and my promise moving inside me like a horse that will not be broken. I escaped with Harriet Tubman. That is true as anything I can say. It is also true that when I did, I left behind a field of faces turned upward, mouths open, hands reaching, and I was only one man with 2 hands. If you want the honest telling, it is this: freedom tasted, of salt and wood smoke and fear, and it did not heal what had been cut, only stopped the cutting and gave me a cloth to press against the wound. I pressed it as hard as I could. I still do. It was the night we nearly lost everything. The air was thick, heavy with summer heat and the smell of wet grass. The kind of night when even the crickets seemed to whisper softer than usual. We had been travelling 2 days with Harriet. 3 of us clinging to her steps as if her very footprints were scripture. I had carried the sound of my son's voice in my chest, each mile making it sharper instead of dimmer, and I swore to myself that this path, this punishing path, was the only way I could one day hold him again. We reached a farmhouse said to be safe. A lantern burned faintly on the porch, the sign Harriet told us to look for. But when we drew close, the door opened wider than expected, and 2 white men stepped out, rifles slung low, their dogs restless at their sides. My heart stuttered, stopped, and then began again in a rush of terror. Betrayal. It was always waiting at the edges of hope. The woman who had promised safety must have been threatened, or tempted by the bounty money. They knew where we were, going. They knew Harriet's face, and here we were, caught in the gap between darkness and the muzzle of a gun. The man nearest us raised his rifle. He told us to kneel. His voice was thick with liquor, but steady enough. The dogs barked and strained, snapping at the air. My first thought was not of myself, but of the others. The woman clutching a shawl to her chest. The man whose wrists were raw from ropes he had only just slipped. If I surrendered, we would all go back. sold off like scattered seed. I saw the lash, the block, the chains, my boy standing on a platform while another man's hand weighed his shoulders like cattle. I knew what awaited us. Harriet's hand rose, steady, silent. She stood between us and the rifles, her body small against their shadows, but her presence greater than both men together. She did not beg, she did not plead. She spoke in a low, sharp voice. "If you fire, make sure you don't miss, for the Lord will count your shot against you." Something in her words, or perhaps the fire in her eyes, made the men hesitate. Still, their fingers twitched near the triggers. In that moment, a choice spread before me. To run meant risking being gunned down like an animal in the field. To stay meant chains for all of us, perhaps death by inches. The silence stretched so long it carved itself into me. My chest burned with the need to act, yet fear weighed my feet. Harriet turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting mine. She did not speak, but I understood. She had carried men and women through worse. She had stared down hunters and masters and devils in human form. She needed me to be brave, not just for myself, but for those who stood trembling at my side. The woman beside me began to sob, the sound of her grief breaking the air open. The dogs lunged forward, snarling, dragging the men a step closer. My hands clenched around a stone I'd picked up earlier, no bigger than a fist, but heavy in its promise. The thought came, swift as a knife. If I struck, maybe we could scatter into the trees. If I missed, we were finished. Then, without warning, Harriet lifted her voice. Not in plea, not in cry, but in song. "Swing low, sweet chariot." Her tone was steady, sure, rolling into the night air as though she was singing to the stars themselves. The sound froze. The men, perhaps they thought her mad, perhaps they heard something they could not name. In that pause we moved. She shoved us back toward the brush, her body between us and the guns. I threw the stone, and it struck one man's lantern clean, sending glass and flame bursting across the dirt. The dogs howled, panicked, the fire catching at their feet. The men cursed, stumbling, and we ran. God, how we ran! Through briars that tore at our legs, over roots that seemed to rise to trip us. The night swallowed us whole. Behind we heard shots crack like thunder, but none found us. The forest closed around, and Harriet's voice still carried, not song, now, but command. "Keep moving, don't stop, don't stop." We did not rest until dawn, collapsing in a hollow where water seeped cold from the earth. My body shook, not from exhaustion alone, but from the weight of what had nearly happened. I saw in my mind my children's faces, the field, the rope, all the fates we had outrun by the width of a single heartbeat. Harriet crouched beside us, her breath even though she had run harder than any of us. She touched my shoulder and said, "The Lord opened a door tonight. Don't you ever forget who slammed it shut on your chains." I did not forget. That night was the turning. The moment I understood that escape was not just a path of feet, but a path of choices made in fire. You must decide whether your fear will rule you or whether you will stand in it and move anyway. I chose, and though I still carry the names of those left behind, I know that without that choice, I would have carried only silence, and silence is the cruelest chain of all. I live now with breath that is my own, yet it never feels wholly mine. Each sunrise that warms my face carries the shadow of those who could not reach it. Freedom gave me soil to till without fear of the overseer, yet my hands still close around the hoe handle as if the lash might strike from behind. In Canada, people speak of liberty as if it is a garment you put on once and wear forever. For me, liberty is thinner, fragile, like cloth that tears if pulled too hard. It holds, but I see the seams. I have walked streets where no patrol waits, where no auction bell tolls, where a child can laugh without fear that his laughter will be cut short by a bill of sale. Yet my own son, My daughter, the wife who bound her heart to mine under the broom. They remain in the fields of my memory, bound to the soil that never let them go. I cannot shake their faces from me, and I do not wish to. To remember them is to keep them alive in some small way, though the world may not know their names. The truth is not simple, nor is it sweet. I escaped with Harriet Tubman. That is the truth. But I did not bring them all, and that truth burns deeper than any chain ever did. Freedom did not erase the wound. It gave me the task of carrying it with dignity. I carry it still, and so I speak, not to unburden myself, but to mark the silence with sound. For silence is a grave without a marker, and I will not let the ones I loved be buried twice. If you remember nothing else of me, remember this. A man can run from chains, but he cannot outrun memory. Memory is what makes us human, and it is what keeps the dead from vanishing into dust. If you have walked with me through these words, then you have carried a weight I have carried all my life. I told it plain as the scars that live on my body and the scars that no eye can see. This story is not for pity, it is for witness. We who were bound in chains were not shadows. We were fathers, mothers, children, lovers, singers of songs, keepers of prayers. What was done to us was meant to vanish when the whip fell silent, but memory does not die so easy. I escaped with Harriet, yes, but my freedom was not whole, for pieces of me remained behind, bound to the cries of those who could not come. Every word I speak now is for them, so that their voices can rise through mine and meet you where you are. If you carry these words onward, then they live again, not as ghosts, but as truth too strong to be buried. That's my story. If this reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again.